The Pullman cars screeched as steel wheels bit against the siding, brakes hissing like steam kettles. It was June 2nd, 1943, in Aliceville, Alabama, a town whose name meant nothing to the men inside the train, though its red earth would mark the beginning of a new existence. Sergeant Hans Muller pressed his forehead to the barred glass. He was 19, barely older than the field-gray tunic on his back, and he expected the end. German rumor mills in Tunisia had painted lurid pictures. Americans shot prisoners or starved them in desert pens. Yet what Muller saw beyond the dusty pane jarred him. Green fields rolling to the horizon, white clapboard houses unscarred by bombers, and Coca-Cola billboards brighter than any propaganda poster in Berlin. The guards ordered them off in clipped English, rifles slung but muzzles down. The prisoners shuffled onto the platform, the humid air wrapping around them like a wet blanket. Miller's boots sank into gravel flecked with red clay. He expected barking, blows, humiliation. Instead, the Americans moved with professional detachment, keeping formation but not cruelty. Some even handed out Lucky Strike cigarettes with a muttered, "Smoke?" They marched down a dirt road toward Camp Aliceville. To German eyes, the sight was staggering. The compound stretched 800 acres across Alabama farmland, its perimeter fenced with double rows of barbed wire and watched over by wooden towers. Inside, neat rows of barracks stood ready, built not as punishment cells, but as dormitories, each with electric light, heating stoves, and screened windows against the southern insects. A hospital stood at the center, alongside a chapel and recreation hall. In the Reich, such resources would have gone to a Panzer division or Luftwaffe squadron. Here, America built an entire town to house its captives. That night, Miller received his first American meal. Tin trays clattered along the mess line. He braced for thin soup, perhaps hard bread. Instead, beef stew thick with carrots and potatoes, 2 slices of soft white bread, and a steaming cup of coffee. He stared at the tray as though it were a trick. Back home, his mother in Saxony queued for hours for bread cut with sawdust. Soldiers on the Eastern Front sometimes fought on horsemeat and rutabagas. Here, the enemy fed him better than his own army had. Corporal James Whitaker of the 45th Infantry Division watched from the corner, jaw tight. Only months earlier, he had fought in Tunisia, where friends fell under German MG-34 fire. Now he stood guard to make sure those same Germans ate well and slept warm. His wife back in Oklahoma rationed sugar and gasoline, yet orders from Washington were clear. Per Article 11 of the Geneva Convention, prisoners must receive rations equal to those of U.S. depot troops. Whitaker muttered to a fellow guard, "Hell, they're eating better than we are." Still, he obeyed. America kept its word even when it hurt. The abundance was not accident, but arithmetic. In 1943, U.S. farmers harvested 3.2 billion bushels of corn and 865 million bushels of wheat, more than all of occupied Europe combined. American fields, untouched by Luftwaffe bombs, produced such surpluses that the nation could feed not only its own GIs, but also its enemies behind barbed wire. A single Midwestern harvest outweighed the Reich's entire ration system. That night, Muller lay on a clean bunk staring at the pine rafters. Outside, spotlight swept across the wire, catching bewildered faces. Somewhere in the Alabama dark, a mockingbird sang. He thought of comrades left in desert graves, of the Führer's promises of glory, of his mother in bread lines. And then he thought of the stew, rich, hot, and plentiful. It did not feel like captivity. It felt like stepping into another world entirely, one where abundance itself was a weapon sharper than any bayonet. The train rattled north again, its steel wheels clacking a rhythm that lulled some prisoners into uneasy sleep. Hans Muller stayed awake, eyes fixed to the barred window. What he saw outside unsettled him more than any guard tower. The Alabama countryside unfolded like a painting, fields lush with corn, neat rows of cotton, and towns where every gas station seemed open, every storefront lit. He saw billboards advertising soap, radios, and chocolate. The war had not touched this land. No rubble, no blackened timbers, no bomb craters gouging the earth. It was, to him, a glimpse of what Germany had already lost. Each crossing brought another surprise. Mile-long freight trains groaning under tanks, jeeps, and crates of wheat. Miller counted the flat cars until his head swam. His officer, Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt, muttered that such displays were for show, that America could never sustain this pace. But the clatter of wheels told a different story. The cars stretched farther than the eye could see, each one laden with material that could outfit a division. The POWs rode in Pullman coaches, the same cars that American civilians used for business and leisure. Clean upholstery, electric fans, and working toilets astonished men accustomed to troop trains in Europe, crowded, filthy, reeking of coal smoke. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans were trying to confuse them with comfort. But the truth was simpler. In America, even prisoner transports shared in the abundance of an untouched industrial network. Corporal James Whitaker, seated near the rear with other guards, watched the prisoners' wide eyes. He had grown up with freight trains cutting across Oklahoma farmland. To him, the sight was ordinary. But now he noticed the Germans staring as though each passing locomotive carried a revelation. Whitaker realized these men were seeing America's war effort with their own eyes. 745 million tons of freight hauled by U.S. railroads in 1944, dwarfing what German lines could ever move. To them, the scale must have looked impossible. At one junction, the train paused beside an army convoy. Dozens of olive-drab trucks idled, their engines coughing diesel fumes into the hot air. American GIs lounged against their vehicles, tossing baseballs back and forth. Among them stood a unit of black soldiers in pressed uniforms, rifles slung with casual pride. The Germans stared, whispering to one another. In Hitler's Reich, such men would never have borne arms, never have stood as equals. Yet here they shared the same road, the same cigarettes, the same laughter. Miller felt the contradiction. America's society bore scars of prejudice, but even within those limits it shattered the Nazi myth of racial hierarchy. The train lurched forward again, rolling through farmland alive with tractors and combines. Eleanor Hayes, an Iowa farmer's wife, later recalled seeing POW trains pass near her fields, windows lined with young faces pressed to the glass. She wondered what they thought as they saw her family's tractor carving furrows into endless acres of corn. For the prisoners, such machines symbolized power as surely as tanks or bombers. As night fell, Muller leaned back, still staring at the streaked window. He thought of German propaganda reels showing America as decadent, weak, divided. Yet here was a nation whose factories rolled out machines faster than armies could burn them, whose fields fed not only its own soldiers but also the men who had tried to kill them. The train whistled as it crossed another junction, sparks flying from steel wheels. To Muller, the sound was not just a signal of movement, it was a declaration. Each whistle, each trainload of material seemed to announce that America's strength was not an illusion. It was iron, steam, and endless motion. As the Pullman rocked him toward another camp, Miller pressed his forehead once more to the glass. He had not yet seen a battlefield here, yet he already knew. The war was lost the moment America put its trains in motion. The cicadas had only just begun their evening chorus when Corporal James Whitaker sat on the edge of his cot cleaning his Springfield rifle. He rubbed the oiled cloth along the bolt, listening to the faint echoes of German voices drifting from the barracks across the compound. Their laughter carried easily through the humid Alabama night. He closed his eyes, and the sound carried him back to Tunisia. February 1943. the Kasserine Pass. Whitaker remembered the staccato roar of MG-34s cutting down his buddies as they scrambled for cover. He had seen Private Harold Evans, just 19, crumple into the sand, chest torn open by German fire. The smell of cordite, the screaming for medics, the dust choking his lungs, all of it returned in an instant. Now those same soldiers, or men just like them, were eating American beef stew under electric lights. Whitaker's jaw clenched as he thought of his wife back in Oklahoma, stretching ration coupons for sugar and meat. She had written of gasoline limits, of lining up for butter substitutes, of sending their 2 boys to school with lunch pails thinner than before. And here he was, ordered to ensure the enemy received the same rations as U.S. depot troops. Orders were orders. The 1929 Geneva Convention, Article 11, left no ambiguity. The food ration of prisoners of war shall be equal in quantity and quality to that of depot troops. The War Department's stance was clear. If Americans treated German prisoners poorly, the Nazis would do the same to captured GIs in Europe. Still, resentment gnawed at him. He thought of the rations his family pieced together: powdered eggs, rationed coffee, the occasional Sunday roast when coupons stretched. In contrast, the prisoners ate 3 meals a day that often surpassed what Whitaker himself received. Beef, bread, potatoes, even coffee, luxuries his boys back home rarely tasted. Locals had begun calling the camp the Fritz Ritz, muttering that the enemy was living better than American citizens. Whitaker, standing post with sweat running down his collar, couldn't argue, and yet something in him resisted the bitterness. Watching the prisoners on work details, he saw they were just boys, calloused hands, tired eyes, no different from his own brothers. Most didn't look like fanatics. They looked like farmers, students, mechanics pulled into uniform. A few still clung to the iron discipline of the Reich, but many looked dazed, as if waking from a fever dream. What struck him most was their confusion at abundance. He had caught one prisoner staring at a trash barrel behind the mess hall, shaking his head at half-eaten bread discarded by guards. Another had quietly pocketed orange peels, marveling that Americans threw away what Germans had rationed for years. Whitaker realized these men weren't just shocked by humane treatment. They were stunned by the wastefulness of a country that could afford it. That was the real weapon, he thought. Not the M1 Garand or the Sherman tank, though those were formidable. It was America's ability to provide, to outproduce, to overwhelm by sheer abundance. A single American farm field could feed a battalion. A single Detroit plant could roll out tanks faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. Whitaker set his Springfield aside, sliding the oiled bolt back into place. Across the compound, the German barracks quieted as lights dimmed. The prisoners slept, bellies full, in bunks that would keep them safe from rain and heat alike. Whitaker sat awake, torn between anger and grudging respect. In the stillness, he whispered a thought he would never share with his men. We'll win this war not because we hate them, but because we can afford to feed them. The morning sun cut across the barbed wire of Camp Concordia, Kansas, casting long shadows on the dirt parade ground. From the towers, sentries scanned the compound, rifles slung casually, but what rose from inside was not the sound of despair. It was laughter, deep, full-throated laughter echoing off wooden barracks. Hans Muller stepped into the yard with hundreds of other prisoners. The wire was real enough, and the guards were armed, yet the atmosphere defied every expectation. Instead of silent misery, he saw soccer balls bouncing, prisoners organizing themselves into teams. Chalk lines marked a field where men in boots and undershirts ran, cheered on by their comrades. Behind the kitchens, others lounged with harmonicas or sketch pads. For a moment, it felt less like captivity and more like a peculiar village where war had been paused. Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt watched with tighter eyes. A veteran officer, he knew what discipline meant. He saw danger in too much liberty, feared that camaraderie and laughter dulled the iron edge of German resolve. He tried to enforce salutes, inspections, even whispered lessons about loyalty to Führer and fatherland. But his men looked at the soccer match with longing. For them, the fences were real, but inside, freedom flickered in ways forbidden back home. The Americans had allowed something remarkable: self-government. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, prisoners elected representatives to speak for them. The camp canteen sold tobacco, chocolate, even beer coupons. The scrip they earned, 80 cents per day for work details, could be exchanged for goods unimaginable in Germany by 1944. One night, Müller attended a music hour in the recreation hall. A piano sat at the front, battered from transport, but its notes rang clear. A fellow prisoner lifted his hands and began Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The room hushed, prisoners closing their eyes, the notes rolling like waves against the wire. Outside, guards leaned against towers, listening too. Müller thought of bomb sirens over Leipzig, of his mother knitting by candlelight, of a world reduced to rubble. And here, in a camp built by the enemy, Beethoven lived again. Corporal Whitaker, walking his post outside, shook his head. He couldn't decide what to make of it: an enemy orchestra in an American camp, playing the music of a culture that had brought his friend's death. But he also couldn't deny its beauty. More than once, he'd found himself tapping his boot to rhythms that transcended the war. What shocked Müller most was abundance's casualness. Bread was everywhere. Cigarettes seemed bottomless. The canteen sold chocolate bars that he hadn't tasted since childhood. Some men stuffed pockets full, hoarding as if the rations might vanish. But they never did. Abundance was normal here, not rationed, not fought over. For Germans raised on scarcity and bomb lines, it was disorienting, more powerful in some ways than any battlefield defeat. Brandt tried to hold the line, but the numbers betrayed him. The United States had produced 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, a figure whispered among the prisoners like myth. When Müller heard it, he almost laughed. Germany's factories, battered by bombs, could never dream of such output. Even the Fritz Ritz nickname that civilians spat at the camp reflected a truth. America could afford generosity because its industry was inexhaustible. That night, as the camp quieted, Müller lay awake under a barracks roof, listening to the last strains of Beethoven drifting into the Kansas dark. He realized that freedom was not always the absence of wire. Sometimes it was the presence of dignity, and that, perhaps, was America's sharpest weapon of all. The cicadas sang their shrill chorus as the morning mist burned off Iowa farmland. Beyond the wire, flat fields stretched to the horizon, stalks of corn waving under a rising sun. For the first time since capture, Hans Müller stepped outside the camp perimeter, not as an escapee, but as a worker. The war had drained America of labor. With millions of men overseas, farms struggled to harvest the food that fueled both civilians and soldiers. The solution came rolling out of POW camps, supervised work crews sent to pick crops, bale hay, or process vegetables in canneries. The Germans climbed into flatbed trucks, guards posted casually at the rails, rifles slung more like reminders than threats. Müller's crew was assigned to the Hayes farm outside Algona. The farmer's wife, Eleanor, stood at the porch as the truck pulled in. She was wary at first. Enemy soldiers on her land felt unnatural. But her husband had been drafted, leaving her with children and acres of corn demanding harvest. As the prisoners stepped down, she studied their faces. They looked less like the monsters from war posters and more like weary boys, their hands calloused from months in the desert. The day's work began with the rhythm of harvest. Prisoners moved down rows, husking corn and stacking ears in woven baskets. Müller marveled at the machinery. The Hayes family owned a tractor larger than anything he had seen in Germany, its steel wheels chewing steadily through the soil. For a moment he forgot he was captive. He felt like a farmhand back home, though the scale was beyond imagining. At noon, Eleanor brought water in tin pails. One prisoner, his English broken but earnest, tried to thank her. "Very good, America." She noticed how carefully they handled the ladles, as if even water drawn from her well was a luxury. When she laid out sandwiches for her children, she saw the Germans watching, eyes fixed on slices of white bread. Bread, in America, was eaten casually. In Germany, it was weighed, measured, sometimes stretched with fillers. She broke an extra loaf and handed it over. The men bowed slightly, murmuring "Danke." Corporal Whitaker supervised from the shade, noting how the work changed the men. Behind the wire they had lounged, smoked, played soccer. Out here among rows of corn, they labored willingly, almost gratefully. It was as if America's land itself demanded respect, its abundance undeniable. Statistics underscored what Miller felt in his muscles. In the Algona region alone, POW labor was valued at $3.5 million during the war. Nationwide, tens of thousands of Germans worked farms, canneries, and lumber mills, production that helped keep America's supply lines overflowing. They were enemies, yet their sweat added to the American war effort. Eleanor saw something else: humanity. When her youngest son toddled toward the prisoners, one knelt, smiling, and offered him an ear of corn like a gift. She realized then that these were not the hardened fanatics she had feared, but boys whose mothers likely waited in ruined towns across the Atlantic. That night, Miller returned to camp with aching shoulders and a pocket lined with canteen scrip, 80 cents credited for his day's work. He bought a chocolate bar at the camp store, savoring each bite slowly, almost reverently. The irony stung. In captivity, he ate foods his family back home had not seen in years. As he lay in his bunk, Miller thought not of barbed wire but of endless cornfields, tractors, and the farmer's wife who broke bread without fear. America's power, he realized, was not just in its rifles or bombers, but in fields so vast they could feed both friend and foe. The nickname spread faster than wildfire across Texas towns: the Fritz Ritz. It dripped with sarcasm, a jab from civilians who clipped ration coupons while enemy prisoners dined on meat and bread. At Camp Hearn, locals pressed their faces to the fence line, muttering about luxury behind barbed wire. Inside, the prisoners lounged in shaded yards, smoking cigarettes bought with canteen scrip. Soccer balls bounced across packed dirt, while orchestras rehearsed Beethoven inside recreation halls. To outsiders, it looked less like a prison and more like a boarding school. Hans Miller noticed the bitterness on the faces of Texans who drove past. Women with ration books in their purses whispered that their own children ate less meat than the enemy. Newspapers sharpened the insult. Germans were being coddled. For Muller, the irony was inescapable. Back home in Leipzig, his mother queued for thin rations, while here, in enemy hands, he ate beef stew with potatoes. Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt seized on the discontent. "See," he told his men, "even Americans despise their own indulgence. They call this camp a Ritz because they know luxury makes men soft." He spoke with conviction, but Miller heard doubt creeping into the ranks. For soldiers raised on scarcity, abundance was not weakness. It was power. Cigarettes proved the clearest symbol. In Germany, tobacco had become scarce by 1944, traded like currency on black markets. Here, prisoners flicked Lucky Strike ashes onto the ground as if they were worthless. Some guards joked that a POW's cigarette stash could rival a sergeant's pay. Bread was another revelation. At first, Germans hoarded crusts, tucking slices under mattresses. But the supply never dwindled. Bread arrived daily, fresh, soft, in quantities that bordered on obscene. When guards noticed uneaten loaves tossed into trash barrels, the prisoners panicked, fearing rations might be cut. To conceal the surplus, some burned leftover bread in stoves, smoke curling out of chimneys like guilty secrets. Corporal Whitaker read letters from home describing shortages. His wife wrote of neighbors saving bacon grease for cooking, of sugar rations stretched with molasses. Meanwhile, he watched German POWs line up for coffee refills. It grated on him, and yet orders were orders. The Geneva Convention demanded parity with U.S. depot troops, and America prided itself on following the rules. The impossible statistic haunted Whitaker's thoughts. In 1944 alone, the United States would produce 100,000 military aircraft, more planes in a year than Germany could build in the entire war. The very excess that allowed prisoners their bread and cigarettes also fueled a war machine so vast it dwarfed anything the Axis could imagine. What civilians called indulgence was, in fact, a symptom of overwhelming power. For Mueller, the contradictions mounted daily. He played chess in the rec hall, then overheard guards joking about Liberty ships launched faster than U-boats could sink them. He read newspapers in the camp library that spoke openly of strikes and elections, things impossible under the Reich. And yet, the greatest shock came not from ideology, but from everyday living. That America could treat its enemies with decency and still have more than enough left to win a global war. That night, smoke from burned bread drifted across the compound, a faint reminder of waste too vast to hide. Mueller lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thought, if this is how America treats its enemies, what chance did we ever have? Christmas Eve, 1944. The desert around Papago Park, Arizona, lay silent under a cold sky pricked with stars. In the shadows near the western fence line, a trapdoor of sand shifted, and one by one, German prisoners wriggled out of a tunnel. Hans Miller's heart hammered as he crawled through the narrow shaft, emerging into dry night air that smelled faintly of creosote and dust. 25 men in all, veterans of the Kriegsmarine, captured U-boat sailors, crept toward freedom. They had planned the escape for months, digging with tin cans and hiding the soil beneath barracks floors. Their plan: follow the Salt River, float downstream, and vanish into Mexico. Each man carried an escape pack. But instead of meager scraps, they were laden with bacon, bread, chocolate, and cigarettes, spoils of captivity. The irony was sharp. Prisoners preparing for a desperate flight carried more luxuries than civilians in Germany could dream of. Some had even packed cans of fruit, heavy in their rucksacks, because they could. The first hours went well. They marched quietly through the desert scrub, the silhouettes of saguaros rising like sentinels. Yet soon they stumbled into a bitter truth. The river they had plotted on their maps was no river at all. It was a dry bed, cracked and empty under the moon. They had assumed water flowed year-round as it did in Europe. Here in Arizona, the Salt River ran only seasonally. The landscape itself betrayed them. By dawn, thirst gnawed at their throats. The desert was vast, indifferent, and open. Without water, their escape unraveled. Some tried to push farther toward the mountains. Others gave up and turned back. Within days, nearly all surrendered voluntarily, approaching farmhouses, knocking on doors, asking in broken English for food or directions. Locals, astonished, phoned the sheriff or military police. The great Christmas breakout ended not in triumph, but in a string of sheepish captures. Corporal Whitaker shook his head when the reports came in. "Hell," he muttered. "They ran away with bacon and came back begging for water." He couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. The men had tunneled for months, only to be undone by a landscape they didn't understand. For Mueller, the failure was humiliating but also instructive. He realized that even America's environment seemed complicit in its strength. In Germany, an escape might mean slipping into thick forests or blending into crowded towns. Here, the land itself was too open, too harsh to hide in. The abundance inside the wire had blinded them to the scarcity beyond it. And yet, the sheer fact of the attempt said something. German discipline, even in captivity, demanded action. But the outcome revealed a larger truth. America could be so generous with its enemies that even escape became a paradox. The prisoners had not fled hunger or brutality. They had fled freedom that felt too strange, only to discover that abundance clung to them like baggage. The numbers told the rest. By the end of the war, the United States had housed more than 425,000 Axis POWs in over 700 camps, and only a tiny fraction had ever attempted escape. Of those, almost all were recaptured quickly, not because of overwhelming guard presence, watchtowers were lightly manned, but because America's size, prosperity, and openness made disappearance nearly impossible. Back inside the fence, Miller lit a cigarette from his escape kit, smoke curling into the winter air. He realized the true futility of their effort. In a nation that could afford to feed its prisoners bacon and chocolate, how could anyone hope to break free? The projector clattered as reels spun in the recreation hall at Camp Concordia, Kansas. Dozens of prisoners of war crowded the benches, cigarette smoke curling into the rafters. On the canvas screen flickered images from American newsreels, assembly lines in Detroit, shipyards along the coasts, factories where sparks showered from welders' torches. Hans Müller leaned forward, stunned. Row after row of bombers rolled from hangars, each polished fuselage gleaming like a promise. Women in coveralls fastened rivets, laughing as cameras caught their smiles. In one clip, a ship slid down greased rails into the water, another Liberty ship borne in a spray of foam. The voiceover boomed, "Another vessel for victory." The numbers struck harder than any artillery barrage. 100,000 aircraft built in 1944 alone. Mueller whispered the figure aloud, scarcely believing it. Germany's factories, shattered by Allied bombing, could barely produce a tenth of that in a year. Even at the height of the Luftwaffe's power, they had never approached such output. Here, America built more planes in 12 months than the Reich could dream of across the entire war. Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt sat rigid, lips pressed thin. He had insisted for months that Germany's technological superiority, jets, rockets, U-boats, would outweigh America's clumsy abundance. But the film strip betrayed him. Statistics marched across the screen like infantry. 2,710 Liberty ships launched during the war, each 441 feet long, built in as little as 44 days. 259,000 aircraft engines produced in 1944 alone, some destined for the new P-51 Mustangs sweeping the skies of Europe. Factories that could turn out a B-24 bomber every hour by running 3 shifts around the clock. Miller watched with awe, but also with a creeping sense of inevitability. How could the Reich stand against an enemy that built ships faster than submarines could sink them, planes faster than flak could shoot them down, tanks faster than artillery could destroy them? The numbers were not propaganda. He had seen the freight trains with his own eyes, endless lines of material rolling through America's unscarred heartland. Corporal Whitaker, stationed at the back of the hall, studied the prisoners' faces in the glow of the projector. He recognized the disbelief. He'd seen the same look on German prisoners during interrogation in Tunisia, when they first realized that the U.S. Army fielded divisions with more trucks than the Wehrmacht had rifles. Now the POWs saw it in living color. For Eleanor Hayes, the farmer's wife in Iowa, the proof came not from film, but from her own harvest. She had watched POWs load trucks with corn, while U.S. Army quartermasters tallied bushels destined for Europe. Her small farm's yield seemed modest, yet she knew it was part of a river of food flowing eastward, grain, meat, and canned goods that kept not only GIs, but also Britain and the Soviet Union fighting. Germany had never matched such logistical reach. Brandt tried to rally his men afterward, insisting that numbers alone did not decide wars. He spoke of discipline, of technology, of the Reich's secret weapons. But Müller saw doubt flicker in the eyes of the younger men. Numbers could not be denied. Abundance was a battlefield, and Germany was outflanked. As the lights flicked on, prisoners blinked at the sudden brightness. The screen went blank, but the figures burned in Müller's mind. 100,000 planes, 2,710 ships, 259,000 engines. He understood now that the war had not only been lost in the deserts of Tunisia or the fields of Stalingrad. It had been lost in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Portland, where freedom's arsenal churned endlessly. Chalk dust rose into the air as the stub squeaked across a blackboard. Inside a drafty barracks at Camp Concordia, Kansas, rows of German prisoners leaned forward on benches, notebooks open. A middle-aged American professor, recalled from a Kansas university for special duty, scrawled across the board in a steady hand, "Democracy is government by consent." Hans Müller copied the words carefully. He was no scholar. Before the Africa Corps, he had worked at his uncle's garage, but the class intrigued him. Mathematics, English, even political science were now offered under what prisoners jokingly called barbed wire college. Some courses were taught by captured German academics, others by Americans drafted into re-education programs. For Müller, it was a doorway into a world he had been taught to fear. The program had begun quietly in 1943, guided by the War Department's Special Projects Division. Its mission, not only to keep prisoners occupied, but to expose them to ideas forbidden in Hitler's Reich. Camp libraries stocked banned authors, from Thomas Mann to Goethe's unedited works. Newspapers circulated with headlines prisoners scarcely believed. Strikes in American factories, political debates broadcast freely, criticism of the president in print without consequence. Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt fumed. He saw the classes as a deliberate attempt to sap discipline. "They poison your minds," he warned his men. "Do not forget your oath." But even he could not silence the murmurs that spread after each lecture. Freedom, it seemed, was not chaos. It was structure with choice, a system that trusted citizens, even in disagreement. For Corporal Whitaker, assigned occasionally to monitor the classes, the scene was surreal. He had grown up in a one-room schoolhouse himself, studying by lantern light. Now he watched his nation's enemies sit in orderly rows, learning from American textbooks. Some guards scoffed, "What's the point of educating the Krauts?" But Whitaker saw a deeper logic. America did not just intend to defeat Germany's army. It intended to dismantle its ideology. Müller found the experience unsettling. Back home, politics had been dictated, not debated. Questions were dangerous. Here, questions were encouraged. One professor asked what democracy required of its citizens. A prisoner raised his hand, haltingly answering, "To obey the law." The professor smiled. "Yes, but also to change the law when it no longer serves justice." The room fell silent. For men conditioned to salute and obey, the thought was revolutionary. Impossible numbers lurked even here. By 1945, American POW camps held more than 425,000 Axis prisoners across 700 camps, and thousands participated in these re-education efforts. No other belligerent nation devoted such resources to teaching its enemies about freedom while the war still raged. It was a logistical feat as impressive in its way as Liberty ships or B-24 bombers, an industrial-scale experiment in ideas. Eleanor Hayes, the Iowa farmer's wife, heard of the classes when POWs returned from work details. One young man, who had practiced English in class, thanked her fluently for the water she brought to the fields. She was startled, not just by the language, but by his earnest tone. It was as if he were trying to prove he had learned something beyond vocabulary, a way of speaking as an equal, not just as a prisoner. Brandt resisted to the end, warning that such freedoms were a trap, yet even he could not stop the quiet transformation. Men debated in the barracks, traded essays, even staged mock elections for camp spokesmen. Behind barbed wire, under guard, democracy was being practiced by those who had once sworn loyalty to dictatorship. That night, as floodlights swept across the Kansas prairie, Miller sat by his bunk, rereading the chalked phrase he had copied, "Government by consent." He wondered what it would mean to return to a Germany where nothing was left but rubble. Perhaps, he thought, the real battle was not between tanks and planes, but between ideas. And here, behind wire, America was already winning. Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt sat hunched over a wooden desk in the barracks, pencil scratching furiously across a scrap of lined paper. He was compiling figures, numbers whispered among prisoners, confirmed by American newspapers that arrived weekly in the camp library. For months, he had dismissed them as propaganda. Now he forced himself to reckon with their terrible consistency. 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war. 8 million rifles manufactured since 1941. 48 billion rounds of ammunition produced in a single year. He paused, staring at the columns. Even written in German hand, the figures looked impossible. Hans Müller watched from a nearby bunk. He had once believed Brandt's speeches about German superiority, their discipline, their technology, their willpower. But the war of numbers told another story. At Stalingrad, whole German armies had been ground into the snow because supply lines collapsed. In Normandy, rumors said the Allies had come ashore with thousands of tanks and planes. The Americans could afford to build more landing craft for one operation than Germany had for an entire war. Corporal Whitaker knew the numbers by heart. During briefings, officers reminded guards that America's strength was not measured in divisions alone, but in factories. "Detroit is our greatest weapon," one colonel had said. Whitaker had seen it himself before shipping out, mile after mile of assembly lines turning out tanks and trucks, machines roaring day and night. He remembered the smell of hot oil, the clang of steel presses, the endless stacks of tires and engines. Germany had no equivalent. Brandt tried to find consolation in German innovation. He wrote Me-262 jet in his column, underlining it twice. V-2 rockets, he added, as if those wonder weapons might balance the scales. Yet even he knew the truth. A handful of jets could not match swarms of Mustangs. Rockets could not feed soldiers or hold territory. Against American output, these marvels were pinpricks. The statistics landed like artillery barrages. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. By 1945, American factories had rolled out 86,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, while Germany struggled to replace losses at Kursk and Normandy. U.S. steel production in 1944 alone reached 82 million tons, 6 times greater than Germany's. Even bread told the story. While German civilians stood in ration lines, American POW camps burned uneaten loaves to hide waste. Miller thought of that smoke curling from stoves, the smell of scorched crust in the air. It was not just food, it was arithmetic, proof of a nation that could afford to throw away more than Germany possessed. Eleanor Hayes glimpsed the imbalance every harvest. POW crews labored in her fields, yet she knew their effort was a fraction of the whole. Across the Midwest, endless combines churned through golden seas of grain. Reports said America had shipped more than 17 million tons of food overseas in 1944, feeding not only its own forces but allies as well. Germany, by contrast, stripped occupied lands bare and still starved. For Müller, the realization came quietly, without speeches or statistics. It came in the sight of trains rolling endlessly past, boxcars filled with machines, while German rails lay twisted under Allied bombs. It came in the taste of sugar in his coffee, sweeter than anything his family could buy back home. Abundance was no longer an anomaly. It was the battlefield itself, and Germany had already lost. Brandt dropped his pencil, staring at the columns of numbers. His hand trembled. Even in victory, Germany would have starved. In defeat, America feasted, and the ledger of war was now written in ink too deep to erase. The winter of 1945 settled heavy over the camps. Word spread quickly. The war was over, and the prisoners would be sent home. Trucks rolled up to the gates, their engines idling in the frost, ready to ferry men to ports where troop ships waited. For Hans Müller, it felt like waking from a long dream, one filled with bread, music, and freedom he could scarcely explain. At Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners lined up with duffel bags, some issued by the U.S. Army, others cobbled from flour sacks. They carried little: Red Cross parcels, letters, photographs of farm families they had worked beside. What they carried in their minds was heavier: the image of abundance, of baseball games, of Beethoven in a Kansas hall. Corporal James Whitaker watched them file out. He had spent 2 years guarding men he once swore he would never show mercy. Now he felt an unexpected tug of respect. They had not escaped, had not rioted, had not poisoned the water with bitterness. They were leaving as different men than those who had arrived. Whitaker tipped his cap to one group boarding a truck. "Safe travels," he muttered, surprising even himself. At ports along the East Coast, embarkation was a scene of contrasts. German prisoners climbed gangways under American flags, bound for a homeland in ruins. They had eaten beef stew and chocolate in captivity. Now they returned to bombed-out cities where mothers queued for scraps. The irony bit deep. Eleanor Hayes, the Iowa farmer's wife, stood among neighbors as the last transport left Algona. She had come to see the nativity scene the POWs carved from plaster, 65 figures of astonishing detail: shepherds, wise men, angels, and the Holy Family stood in quiet dignity, a gift from captives to a town that had feared them. Snow dusted the figures as children pressed close to marvel. Eleanor realized then that the prisoners had left behind more than labor. They had left a testimony of shared humanity. For Müller, the departure was a blur of faces and landscapes. From Iowa's cornfields to New York's crowded docks, he saw again the abundance that had astonished him from the first train ride. Tractors plowing, trains hauling, stores filled with goods even as the nation demobilized millions of soldiers. He thought of his mother in Leipzig, standing in line for black bread. How could he explain that in captivity he had eaten better than she had in freedom? Statistics framed his journey home. Between 1945 and 1946, more than 425,000 German POWs were repatriated from the United States. They boarded Liberty ships, vessels of American mass production, to be carried back across the Atlantic. Many would spend months more in British or French custody, laboring to rebuild Europe. But those who had been in America carried stories that sounded like fantasy to their countrymen. Whitaker, back in Oklahoma, read in the paper about the repatriations. He felt a quiet pride. America had fought with rifles and tanks, but it had also fought with bread, decency, and an industrial might so vast it could afford generosity. His wife still rationed sugar, but he knew their sacrifices had built something greater than victory. They had built proof that democracy could defeat dictatorship not just with bullets, but with abundance. On the ship's deck, Müller stood at the rail as New York Harbor faded into mist. He clutched a Red Cross parcel, but his thoughts lingered on the taste of chocolate, the sound of Beethoven, the sight of endless trains rolling through a land unscarred by war. He was returning to ruins, but he carried in his mind the memory of freedom. December 1945. Snow fell gently over Algona, Iowa, blanketing the quiet town in white. Inside the local church, townsfolk gathered to see what the German prisoners had left behind, a nativity scene carved from plaster, 65 figures in all. Shepherds knelt with folded hands, angels lifted trumpets. The Christ child rested in Mary's arms. Each face was painstakingly shaped by POW hands, drawn from memory and devotion. The figures glowed in candlelight, a gift of faith from men once called enemies. Eleanor Hayes stood among the crowd, her children clutching her skirt. She studied the detail, the careful folds of robes, the carved grain of wooden staffs. For her, the nativity was more than a holiday decoration. It was proof that even in captivity, dignity could flourish. These men had harvested her corn, drunk water from her well, and returned each evening behind the wire. They had left her town not with bitterness, but with beauty. Half a world away, Hans Müller stepped off a transport into the ruins of Leipzig. The station roof was shattered by bombs, the streets lined with rubble. His mother wept when she saw him, thinner than when he left but alive. As she prepared a meal of thin soup, Müller hesitated. How could he explain that in America, behind barbed wire, he had eaten beef, chocolate, and fresh bread? How could he tell her of Beethoven concerts, baseball games, and classrooms where democracy was taught openly? It felt like describing another planet. The contrast was staggering. Germany in 1945 was a wasteland, its cities flattened, its people hungry, its armies shattered. America, by comparison, had emerged from the war stronger than ever. Its factories had produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2,710 Liberty ships, and billions of rounds of ammunition. Its fields had yielded enough grain to feed not only its soldiers but its allies and its prisoners as well. No nation in history had wielded such abundance as a weapon. Corporal James Whitaker, back in Oklahoma, read about Europe's starvation winter in the papers. He remembered the POWs burning bread in camp stoves to hide waste, and he shook his head. The numbers told the truth. America could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own citizens. That, more than any battle, was the decisive proof of victory. Historians would later note the irony. The United States, while rationing at home, created camps so humane that German prisoners left as witnesses to American prosperity. They carried stories back to the Reich that sounded unbelievable. Baseball under the sun, endless cigarettes, freedom even behind fences. For many, those memories became seeds of change in post-war Germany. When democracy returned, it carried with it echoes of what they had glimpsed in captivity. The nativity scene in Algona became a symbol. Visitors came each Christmas to marvel at its craftsmanship, never forgetting that it was born in a POW camp. It stood as quiet testimony that America had won not just with tanks and planes, but with generosity that turned enemies into reluctant admirers. Snow settled on the carved shepherds that winter night in Iowa. Across the ocean, in ruined cities, former prisoners remembered the bread, the music, the freedom they had tasted behind American wire. The war had been won with steel, oil, and blood, but also with abundance, dignity, and faith. America had proved that democracy's greatest weapon was not hate, but the power to share plenty, even with its foes.